If you think catastrophe announces itself, Atlanta will prove you wrong. July 29, 1999. Sunlight draped over glass towers in Buckhead, the city's glossy business district. It was a Thursday, late morning edging into lunch. Office doors clicked, elevators sighed, and somewhere above Piedmont Road, a room full of screens flickered green and red like a private weather system. This was the season of day trading, the dot-com fever dream when ordinary people chased extraordinary gains one mouse click at a time. Inside two suites a block apart, Momentum Securities and All-Tech Investment Group, the atmosphere had its own pulse. Headsets, styrofoam cups, the staccato of keys. Men and women hunched over level 2 quotes, riding the NASDAQ like a roller coaster built from caffeine and margin. They weren't co-workers in the old sense. Each traded their own money, renting a station and a connection, hoping to end the day taller than they began it. A good morning felt like genius. A bad one felt like an eraser on your life. Into that world had walked a man with a past no ticker could price. Mark Orrin Barton, 44. Born in Georgia, raised around Air Force bases, chemistry degree, salesman's smile. He looked like an accountant who favored khakis and a tucked shirt, but he carried two timelines that never should have converged. One was money, the seductive, ruinous math of late 90s day trading. The other was violence, first whispered, then undeniable. People at the Buckhead firms remembered him as a swing between charm and friction. He had that market-addled bravado the regulars called the Rocket, a nickname you earn when your wins explode and your losses crater. He'd been riding the internet stocks everyone swore only went up, until they didn't. In May and June of 1999, the losses began to stack. Screens that once felt like wings turned into brick walls. By midsummer, he was down more than $100,000 in barely 8 weeks. Money he couldn't afford to watch evaporate. The firm that had given him a terminal closed his account. Whatever grace remained between Barton and the market was gone. That financial collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. Barton's personal history already carried a grim footnote. Back in 1993, over Labor Day weekend, his first wife, Deborah, and her mother, Eloise Spivey, were found bludgeoned to death in a lakeside camper in northeast Alabama. Barton was the prime suspect, questioned, scrutinized, never charged. He collected a substantial insurance payout after Deborah's murder, money that later helped bankroll his trading habit. The case went cold. The suspicion never did. By 1995, Barton had married Lee Ann Vandiver, a co-worker from a health products job. They lived in Stockbridge, south of Atlanta, with his children from the first marriage, Matthew, 11, and Michelle, 8, splitting time under custody agreements that only families and judges can understand. To neighbors, Barton looked like a man assembling a second act, cul-de-sac house, commute, a fresh try at ordinary. But ordinary doesn't sit well with pressure. Through the spring of 1999, his mood soured. He told friends and relatives he felt targeted, ruined by the market, and the people who profited while he bled. He wrote at night, sitting at a home computer, pouring out a dread that came in waves. I have been dying since October. I wake up afraid. Paranoia and despair braided into a single story he repeated in his head until it hardened into motive. The week that would end in Buckhead began in Stockbridge, in a quiet subdivision behind hedges and mailboxes with cheerful flags. According to the notes police would later recover, Tuesday, July 27th, just before dawn, Barton bludgeoned Lee Ann as she slept. He left her body in the master bedroom, covered with a blanket, a grim tenderness that does not reduce the cruelty. The next night, Wednesday, July 28th, he turned the same weapon on his children, Matthew and Michelle, in their beds. He wrote that he kissed them after. He wrote that he loved them. He wrote that he did not plan to live much longer. He wrote that before he died, he intended to kill as many as sought my destruction. Morning came, as it always does, oblivious. Barton cleaned up what he could, left typed notes in different rooms, explanations, denials, that line about not living long, and a furious insistence that he hadn't killed his first wife and mother-in-law. Then he dressed, pocketed a small arsenal, 2 handguns loaded and ready, and drove toward Buckhead, where the screens glowed, and his old rage had a street address. Here's what the people at those trading floors couldn't see. A man with 2 funerals already in his house, a boot-heel grind of debt and humiliation, a mind that had assigned human faces to the abstract idea of loss. He had been banned from trading at one firm, seethed at managers in the other. In the boiling logic inside his skull, these rooms weren't just rooms. They were culprits. It's easy, decades later, to turn the day trading boom into a punchline. But in 1999, it felt like a revolution. Wired phones were becoming broadband lines. Brokerages opened storefronts with the promise that speed and nerve could beat Wall Street at its own game. The stakes were larger than anyone admitted. Some traders mortgaged homes to fund accounts. Others borrowed on margin, magnifying gains and losses. People talked about freedom and used words like edge and momentum, like magic spells. They also quietly took antacids before lunch. On that Thursday, the floors looked normal. At Momentum, a manager did the morning walkthrough. At Alltech, traders compared war stories from the open, a fast pop here, a whipsaw there. A secretary reheated coffee that would never taste right again. Security, such as it was, meant a receptionist and an elevator key. Guns belonged to movies, not to Buckhead at noon. Barton parked, angled for casual, and stepped into the first lobby. People recognized him. The circuit wasn't large. He made a line or two of small talk, a joke with a serrated edge, something like, "I hope this doesn't ruin your trading day." The words landed as gallows humor in a room where fortunes rose and fell before lunch all the time. No one stood up. No one reached for a phone. No one could imagine what the next minutes would do to the map of their city. That's where we pause, because this is not just a story of gunfire. It's the anatomy of a pressure cooker with a man for a lid, and it needs to be told with the people he ruined at the center, not the man who ruined them. It took less than an hour to turn Buckhead into a map of sirens. Late morning slid toward lunch on July 29, 1999, and the Momentum Securities office was doing what it did every weekday, renting out speed and nerve by the terminal. Phones tucked under chins, eyes pinned to level 2 quotes, the hum of a room where everyone's heartbeat sinks to the NASDAQ. The door opened. Mark Barton stepped in looking like a man stopping by to say he'd turned a corner. Some recognized him. This circuit was small. He had traded here until the losses piled up and the firm closed his account. He could be charming when it served him. He said something that people would later repeat with a shudder. "I hope I'm not ruining your trading day." In a room where fortunes crash before lunch, it landed like gallows humor. Heads turned back to screens. Then he drew 2 pistols. The first seconds were a physics problem no one should have to solve. Angles, distances, the way sound behaves in a glass and drywall rectangle. Muzzle flashes cracked the low light of monitors. A trader pitched sideways. A manager grabbed for a phone and didn't make it. The room tried to scatter and realized there was no direction that wasn't toward the gunfire, because that's how small rooms are when the shots begin. When the noise ebbed, 4 people were dying where they'd been sitting a minute earlier. Edward Quinn, Kevin Dial, Russell Brown, Scott Webb, men whose names in the day trading world were just first names and P and L lines until a gun turned them into obituaries. Others were wounded, some gravely, some in ways that would echo for years whenever doors slammed or elevators jumped. Barton didn't run for the highway. He walked, calmly, witnesses said, across Piedmont Road, toward Alltech Investment Group, another storefront for the dream of beating the market on raw reflex. The walk between the two offices should have been nothing, maybe a joke later about a bad morning. It became a corridor between crime scenes. At Alltech, people looked up and saw a familiar face. This too was a place he'd traded and fought with bosses over rules and margin and the humiliations that come when a man insists the world is rigged against him. He asked to speak with two of them, Brent Doonan and Scott Manspeaker. An assistant, Kathy Camp, stepped in with them. Barton told them he had something you're going to want to see. He closed the door. He opened fire. Inside that small room, seconds lengthened into a lifetime. Doonan was hit again and again and didn't die. 5 bullets, and still not dead. Because human beings are stranger and tougher than we give ourselves credit for. Manspeaker went down bleeding. Camp took rounds that blinded her and stole a future she'd been building one hard day at a time. Barton reloaded, calm, deliberate, and walked back into the open suite the way someone steps off an elevator. The rest of Alltech tried to become 100 different things at once: floor, wall, doorway, absence. But a trading room isn't a maze. It's rows of screens and chairs, the opposite of cover. Barton moved through it like he was checking quotes, only now every stop was a target. He shot 5 more people dead in the open area: Alan Tenenbaum, Dean Delawala, Joseph Desert, Jamshid Havash, Vadawati Muraladhara, and wounded others who would never again be mistaken for ordinary when they walked into a quiet room. The math of the rampage across both suites would be counted later: 9 killed, 13 wounded, 39 shots. But numbers don't catch the shape of the panic that poured into the Buckhead streets. Traders from neighboring offices ran down stairwells in dress shoes that weren't built for sprinting. Phones flooded 911 until the board looked like static. Patrol cars converged on Piedmont, lights turning midday into a kind of false midnight. Back at Momentum, a survivor sat with his back against a partition that hadn't protected him from anything, dialing a number he didn't remember deciding to dial. At Alltech, a man shoved a rolling chair against a bleeding friend to lift his legs because that's what someone's father had taught him to do once, and sometimes instincts are a kind of miracle. A woman knelt over a body and said a prayer in a language that didn't need translation. Another woman's hands shook so hard she couldn't get the cap off a water bottle, and someone else took it, opened it, and set it down. A tiny act of care inside a room that had just been turned inside out. Barton left before the first cruiser nosed into the curb. He didn't sprint. He didn't look back. The walk from Alltech to the parking deck was the same length it had been on any other day. He drove away in his minivan with the same calm a man might use to run errands. If you want to understand why the next hours felt like a city holding its breath, start there: the monstrous ease of exit. Police pushed the first circle out fast, building lockdowns, perimeter calls, helicopters. The name Mark Barton moved over the radio, and then over televisions, and then into homes. Reporters said day trader because that's how we made sense of things then. The market was the story people understood. But this wasn't about a screen. It was about a man who had already left 3 bodies under blankets in a Stockbridge house, and who had written in the quiet of early mornings that he did not plan to live much longer. Just long enough to kill as many as sought my destruction. Back at the house, detectives moved through rooms that had been staged by a different kind of calm. Lee Ann in the master bedroom, Matthew and Michelle in theirs. Notes on a computer, notes on a bed, a voice trying to organize blame into sentences that could carry it. The familicide explained the flatness witnesses had seen in Barton's face, The person who does this has already stepped past a cliff. Meanwhile, Buckhead hardened into the choreography of a major incident. Triage points, ambulances vectored to different hospitals so no ER buckled, family reunification set up in a lobby that smelled like coffee and fear. Officers searched cars and closets and the corners of parking decks because you look everywhere when you don't yet know where to look. On TV, anchors repeated the same 3 facts, then repeated them again because repetition is what you do when certainty is scarce. 2 offices, 9. Dead, suspect at large. People who had shared rooms with Barton tried to explain the contradiction to microphones. He'd been polite, chatty, normal, until he wasn't. He'd been ruined by the market, they'd heard, and he wore the kind of bitterness that sounds like a theory of everything when you're down 6 figures. But thousands of people were down in 1999 and didn't pick up pistols. That's the part we never get to solve with charts. Why one man chooses to make a city answer for his losses. By mid-afternoon, the manhunt stretched from Buckhead to the northern suburbs. A sighting near Kennesaw lit up the radio. A girl approached, a threat, a minivan spotted, then a chase, threaded highways and side streets, until it played out beside a gas station in Ackworth. Officers closed in. The city exhaled before it should have. Barton raised a gun to his own head and took the coward's door out of accountability. The shot ended the chase and guaranteed the questions would never meet a confession. Sirens turned Atlanta into a compass. North, west, every highway, shoulder a possible page of the story. Police helicopters shouldered the July heat, orbiting the glitter of Buckhead as units fanned across Cobb and Cherokee counties, radios stitching neighborhoods together with the same 3 words: suspect at large. The name moved faster than traffic. Mark Barton, mid-40s, khakis, and calm, armed, fleeing in a minivan. That ordinary vehicle made the city feel suddenly crowded with suspects. Minivans were everywhere in 1999. Family wagons idling at lights while their drivers looked around and wondered whether the person in the next lane had just murdered 9 people in 2 office suites and walked away. The calls began to stack. A gas station attendant thought he recognized the face. A driver swore a van had swerved at her, as if testing what panic looked like. A suburban strip mall saw a man stare too long, then turn away. Dispatchers peeled true from noise and pushed patrols toward the sightings that felt like more than fright. The circle tightened along I-75. A report out of Kennesaw. A girl approached, a threat, a van, then another sighting. Then a chase that threaded frontage roads and turn lanes and finally decanted into a gas station in Ackworth where the afternoon seemed to hold its breath. Patrol cars boxed the van the way experience teaches them to, angles that make escape a geometry problem. Officers stepped out, took cover, issued commands that felt too small for the scale of the day, but were exactly right for the seconds they were in. And then, before anyone could translate authority into custody, Barton raised a pistol and shot himself. The sound bounced once off canopy metal and became the wrong kind of silence. That single act stole what the city most wanted: a trial, testimony, an answer spoken out loud that could be cross-examined. It left instead the thin comfort of paper, the notes he'd typed and left behind in Stockbridge, the fragments of his story he'd drafted in the nights before the rampage, when he was rehearsing how to explain the unforgivable. Detectives had already begun moving through that house with the careful grief of professionals who know they are walking on a family's last ordinary objects. In the master bedroom, Lee Ann, covered. Down the hall, Matthew, 11, and Michelle, 8, each in their rooms, the kind of neat that only happens when sleep has no reason to defend itself. On a computer and on beds, pages no adjective can redeem, confession and denial braided together. He wrote that he'd killed Lee Ann Tuesday before dawn. He wrote that he'd killed the children Wednesday night. He wrote that he loved them, a sentence that collapses under its own hypocrisy. He wrote he did not kill his first wife, Deborah, or her mother, Eloise Spivey, back in 1993, though he'd long been the only person the world suspected. He wrote he had been ruined by losses and by enemies he named in the vaguest terms possible. They, a pronoun designed to carry a grudge without shouldering proof. He also wrote the line that tells you everything you need to know about the days that followed. He did not intend to live long, only long enough to kill as many as he could of those he believed had sought his destruction. It is the manifesto of a grievance, looking for faces. Back in Buckhead, the tally of the rampage set into shape. In the Momentum Security Suite, Edward Quinn, Kevin Dial, Russell Brown, Scott Webb, gone in seconds. Others maimed. The smell of gunpowder still braided into the carpeting by the time evidence teams began their measured walk. In Alltech Investment Group, Brent Doonan shot, and somehow alive. Scott Manspeaker gravely wounded. Kathy Camp blinded. And in the open trading room, Alan Tenenbaum, Dean Delawala, Joseph Dezur, Jamshid Havash, Vedawati Muralidhara, names the city would memorize because the city refused to remember just the shooter. Evening News did what it could with the mismatch between the public's appetite for order and the day's refusal to provide it. Anchors repeated the sequence and then repeated it again. 2 offices, 9 dead, 13 wounded, 39 shots, manhunt, suicide, family slain earlier in the week. Reporters filled in the pieces that made this massacre feel both inevitable and impossible. Barton's 6-figure losses in a 2-month slide, his removal from a trading terminal, the day trading fever of 1999, the glass storefronts where you could rent a chair and try to outclick the market, the old Alabama double homicide of his first wife and mother-in-law that read now like a red flag on a pole no one wanted to see. But the most important work wasn't on television. It happened in waiting rooms and kitchens and hospital corridors. Families walked into rooms that had new rules. A chaplain near the door, a detective with a notebook, a nurse whose posture told you the truth before her mouth did. Survivors learned the vocabulary they would carry for the rest of their lives, through and through nerve damage, PTSD, rehab. Men who had spent their mornings staring down the NASDAQ now stared down the simple heroism of standing up and not falling. Women who had been secretaries became coordinators of care, phoning co-workers' families with voices that tried to stay level and almost did. Investigators harvested what paper could give. The Stockbridge notes laid out a timeline that was both methodical and monstrous. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, as if the killings had been items on a planner. Bank records, phone logs, neighbors' recollections, a reconstruction that made clear what the suicide had tried to erase. This had not been a snap. It had been a project. Grief leaked into policy because policy is the only language institutions have when hearts are broken. The companies re-examined access to their suites. Lobbies that had been designed for speed now learned to say wait. Day trading as a business model took its own hit from the massacre and, soon after, from the dot-com crash. The idea that adrenaline and level 2 quotes could substitute for experience started to look like a danger sign instead of a promise. And in homes all over Atlanta, people revised the way they told the story of the late 1990s. Not just a time of easy gains, but a time when one man's ruin metastasized into a city's. None of this is the kind of closure storytellers like. The killer took that with him under a canopy at an Ackworth gas station. There would be no cross-examination, no courtroom map of motives, no apology bigger than the page he left in a house full of bodies. What remained were names and the refusal to let those names be swallowed by the outline of a man who chose the shortest road out of accountability. If you're looking for meaning, the honest answer is smaller than we want it to be. It lives in the way Buckhead breathed again the next day. It lives in the survivors who learned how to walk into rooms without flinching at sudden sounds. It lives in parents who explained to children why some neighbors were on the news, and then turned the TV off because children don't need more than the truth can hold. It lives in the odd mercy that paperwork offers, death certificates and insurance forms, and HR letters that say a company knows your name and your loss, and will keep saying both until the early chaos gives way to ordinary administration. There is a last thread that matters because it keeps the story honest. Lee Ann, Matthew, Michelle. Before Buckhead, before the Chirons and the helicopter shots, the massacre began in a quiet Stockbridge house, where a woman and 2 children went to sleep expecting to wake. We do not say their names as an aside. We say them because that is where the sentence starts, and sentences that start anywhere else risk turning a rampage into a spectacle. The morning after the shootings, Atlanta woke up slow and careful, like a city learning how to move with a bruise. Buckhead's towers still threw light across Piedmont Road, but the glass felt thinner. Offices where traders once sprinted for openings now filled with a quieter choreography. Counselors in chairs usually reserved for compliance talks, coffee that went cold because hands forgot to drink, managers speaking in first names because titles had no use. The day's agenda was grief. Funerals arrived in clusters, the way tragedies force calendars to accept the unacceptable. At each service, a small biography took center stage and refused to yield to the final headline. Edward Quinn, who loved lake mornings and taught his kids to tie fishing knots so carefully they never needed help twice. Kevin Dial, the steady friend who answered calls at midnight and brought his own toolbox when your sink leaked. Russell Brown, who never missed his nephew's games even when the market misbehaved. Scott Webb, the quick laugh in a quiet room, a person who could make a screen glow seem less lonely. At Alltech, the names gathered like an honor roll of ordinary excellence. Alan Tenenbaum, a father who kept ticket stubs from every film he took his children to see. Dean Delawala, the one who checked on you after a rough session without making a show of it. Joseph Desert, who baked on Sundays and handed out leftovers like it was a calling. Jamshid Havash, meticulous and generous, a teacher by temperament even when trading alone. Vadawati Muraladhara, a calm presence who remembered birthdays and asked about parents by name. In those rooms, the words day trader fell away. The people remained. Hospitals learned new routines for old injuries. Surgeons finished their work and handed patients to therapists who began the long, unglamorous campaign of getting bodies and minds to trust rooms again. A man who had spent his mornings reading the NASDAQ now practiced standing up and walking 3 steps without dizziness, then 10, then to the door and back. A woman who had arranged appointments and payables learned to navigate hallways without light because brightness triggered headaches. Families learned the vocabulary of recovery, nerve damage, range of motion, startle response, nightmares that recede if you talk to them before sleep. Some days were victories no one outside the room would ever notice, like buttoning a cuff with your non-dominant hand. Others were setbacks carried quietly to protect a child from seeing fear on a parent's face. At Alltech, the 3 people Barton drew into a private room became a living lesson in both the cruelty and stubbornness of life. Brent Doonan, shot 5 times, survived, and began the ordeal of healing that defies narrative arcs. Scott Manspeaker, critically wounded, rebuilt himself one difficult day at a time. Kathy Camp, left blind, refused to be reduced to the sentence that blinded her. She learned new ways to move through a world that had taken sight but not agency. Their courage did not erase what happened in that office. It made what happened share space with something stronger. The companies faced their own reckoning. Security that once meant a receptionist and a polite phone call turned into a playbook. Controlled access, visitor logs that weren't suggestions, Training that wasn't a checkbox. Glass doors that had once symbolized transparency learned to slow people down. Those changes would later blend into the background and be forgotten by everyone, not forced to remember why they were written. That is how safety is supposed to work. Visible at first, then steady enough to disappear into habit. The day trading world itself changed with the weather of history. The dot-com bubble, so buoyant that it taught amateurs to treat luck as skill, deflated and then burst. The storefront trading rooms thinned, some shuttering, others morphing into different models. The massacre did not cause the crash, but it rewrote the mythology. The idea that adrenaline alone could beat a market stopped sounding like a promise and started sounding like a warning. The few rooms that remained learned discipline the hard way. Capital requirements, risk controls, a culture that valued stopping as much as starting. Law and policy turned slowly, as they do, but they turned. Building managers across the city updated emergency protocols that they had treated like binder filler. Police improved the way information moved between jurisdictions, ironing out seams a man in a minivan had slipped through. Dispatch centers reviewed how to separate rumor from real time. Even small measures found their place. Better signage for exits, silent alarms with no theater, drills that started awkward and ended automatic. None of it would make the news when it worked. All of it would matter the next time a Thursday tried to be ordinary and wasn't. In Stockbridge, neighbors mowed a lawn that didn't need it and carried casseroles into a kitchen where no one was hungry. Leanne's friends sat at a table and said her name until the air felt bearable again. Teachers put together a small folder of Matthew's drawings and Michelle's spelling tests because families need tangible things to hold when words fail. The house on a cul-de-sac learned to absorb visits from relatives, detectives, and reporters without losing its dignity. The notes Barton left did not explain anything. The community refused to let those notes be the last word. There were quiet acts of resilience scattered across the city, too small for cameras and too important to overlook. A receptionist went back to work in a different lobby and discovered that greetings can be a form of strength. A trader who had survived decided never to trade alone again, building a ritual of morning check-ins that doubled as friendship. A manager who had frozen at the sound of a backfired truck practiced standing still when a door slammed, so the sound would lose its power over time. These are not movie moments. They are the daily work of refusing to let fear set the calendar. Anniversaries came and went, often unmarked in public, but precise in private. On those days, families drove different routes to avoid certain corners, or they drove directly to those corners because avoidance had stopped helping. Some visited 2 addresses, a cemetery and a quiet stretch of Piedmont Road where a tower of glass throws off noon light. Others honored the past by planning the future. College funds continued for children, scholarships created in the names of the lost, small grants to emergency responders from people who had learned that uniforms hold entire cities together. If you're measuring meaning, keep the unit of measure small. It is not in the killer's notes or in the way the market corrected. It's in the practiced steadiness of survivors who took back office chairs, grocery aisles, and elevators. It's in the way people said each victim's name in rooms where their families could hear them, said with affection instead of pity. It's in the promise that businesses made quietly to each other across Buckhead, to keep doors open without pretending the world is harmless. So this is where the story ends because this is where it should end, with names and the commitments attached to them, with Lee Ann, whose last morning should have been coffee and a commute, with Matthew and Michelle, whose back-to-school lists were probably on the counter, with Edward, Kevin, Russell, Scott, Alan, Dean, Joseph, Jamshid, and Vedawati, whose chairs at lunch tables stayed empty, and whose work, love, and jokes stay present in the sentences of the people who miss them most. With the wounded, who decided again and again to rebuild what could be rebuilt. With a city that learned to breathe through pain and then to move in ways that honor what it learned. If you ever pass those addresses, you won't see plaques or parades. You'll see people going to work, carrying coffee, checking their watches, heading home. That is not indifference. That is victory. A Thursday tried to break them. They made 1,000 Thursdays since, quiet, ordinary, intact. That's what endures. If you want true cases told without sensationalism, with the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Lee Ann, Matthew, Michelle, Edward, Kevin, Russell, Scott, Alan, Dean, Joseph, Jamshid, and Vedwati. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making careful, respectful storytelling.